Could France have continued the war in 1940 from Brittany? This surprising hypothesis was seriously considered by French leaders in May to June 1940. But why this idea, and was it credible? That's what I suggest we discuss today. During the month of May 1940, the French army and its allies, then led by Supreme Commander Maurice Gamelin, had just experienced a true military disaster. During the first phase of the French campaign, this failure led to the dismissal of the Supreme Commander, who was hastily replaced on May 19, 1940, by the experienced Maxime Weygand. The latter, whose character was better suited, took control as best he could, and he determined that the final act of the Battle of France would take place along an axis stretching from Abbeville to Montmédy. However, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, backed by the determined Charles de Gaulle, proposed a new idea starting on May 29th. And what if the French army instead retreated to Brittany in order to continue the war there? Specifically, the idea is to define a new area in mainland France where the French government could settle permanently, defended by what remains of the French army, which would then be supplied by sea by its empire and by its allies. The fact of studying this hypothesis is not absurd, and on the contrary, illustrates a political will to continue the war, one way or another, a will that was particularly rare at the time. However, it comes up against the reality of a military situation that is nothing short of catastrophic. However, the new Supreme Commander successfully turns the situation around, for better or worse. In fact, in order to analyze the significance of the Breton Redoubt from both a political and military perspective, it is first necessary to fully understand the situation France is in at the end of May 1940. On the military side, as of May 26th, the French army is officially alone, following the Belgian capitulation and the unilateral withdrawal of British troops who have retreated to Dunkirk. To exacerbate the issue, the French army's current situation is in itself particularly serious. During the fighting in May, the French army lost a third of its divisions, 3/4 of its modern equipment, a good part of its most experienced infantry divisions, as well as 2 of its 4 powerful armored divisions. While the 2 survivors are severely weakened in the skies, it's no better since the Air Force is then locally vastly outmatched by the German Air Force and is unable to tip the balance in favor of the French in the ground battles. In fact, Generalissimo Weygand thus has, over the entire Northeast Front, no more than 60 infantry divisions, often incomplete, among which 17 fortress divisions are immobilized on the Maginot Line, as well as the meager remnants of the French mobile divisions, which are the light mechanized divisions and the armored divisions previously mentioned. He must therefore try to organize the country's last line of defense with 43 essential divisions, weakened or incomplete and not very mobile. These must be organized quickly along an extended front totaling 360 kilometers, on positions that are generally not favorable and of course are also not fortified. But what do they have in front of them? Well, these 43 infantry divisions, despite being supported by about 600 French tanks of all types, are facing nothing less than 80 German divisions, including 2,100 tanks, concentrated within 10 powerful armored divisions, the famous Panzer divisions. In short, the situation is severely unfavorable. At the end of May, army morale wavers, while most of the country's political leaders already sense defeat. But despite this, Weygand, while fully aware that a positive outcome is unlikely, shows character and organizes a final defense. This provides credibility and new opportunities for the French army. If it manages to hold steadfast along the entire Abbeville-Montmédy axis until June 15th, the rebuilding of strong reserves behind its lines will not only allow it to hold, but also to operate, one of the greatest turnarounds in history. If you're interested in the details of this topic and this battle, I'll share a full documentary about it at the end of the video. For this documentary, here are the main points of Supreme Commander Weygand's plan, called the Vegan Line when implemented on the ground. The new Supreme Commander first tries to learn from the lessons of the May debacle by relying on feedback from the many veterans. He personally meets with them about the first weeks of combat in order to have a good understanding of how events unfolded, what was lacking, but also what worked. And these discussions allow the Supreme Commander to pinpoint two essential aspects of how the events unfolded. The German forces' speed and mobility caused the most damage to the French army. Meanwhile, the French infantry, sorely lacking these advantages, at the same time demonstrated a remarkable ability to hold their ground, even when surrounded. Weygand rejects the static linear defense doctrine of his predecessor, overturning French strategic doctrine. Maurice Gamelin was easily pushed back by the German mobile divisions. He adopts a defense-in-depth strategy, using infantry units in a checkerboard pattern with artillery support, while being organized to form autonomous and strong islands holding on to the terrain. This is how he employs the hedgehog tactic, temporarily restoring hope to the French army. This comes just days away from a significant achievement. As evidence of its effectiveness, this tactic was later adopted by the Americans and NATO forces during the war. However, when this system was physically broken by the German army on June 11, 1940, the French army was definitively defeated with no hope of recovery. But then, wouldn't it have simply been better to try to retreat to Brittany in order to establish the famous Breton Redoubt there and concentrate what was left of the French forces? There are two opposing views on this subject, and strangely enough, both of them are perfectly valid. The concept of the Breton Redoubt is introduced for the first time. On May 29, 1940, Renault asked his Supreme Commander to study the matter. This idea is defensible from both internal political and geopolitical perspectives. Renault, like de Gaulle, comprehending the ideology of France's foes, knew that Nazi Germany would provide no satisfactory resolution if France lost. Any form of stopping the fighting would thus automatically mean the fall of the Republican regime in France, and, at the very least, the guaranteed loss of the country's place on the world diplomatic stage, and perhaps, along with it, its empire. The country has promised Great Britain not to sign any separate peace treaty. Renault, like de Gaulle, although aware of and annoyed by the British shortcomings during the Battle of France, analyzes the situation as follows. France, even if defeated in the mainland, continues to exist physically through its empire as well as its overseas territories. Meanwhile, Great Britain, his ally, remains at war and appears ready to keep fighting, albeit cautiously. It has preserved its core fighting capabilities and maintains a powerful empire, whose jewel is nothing less than the rich and populous Indian subcontinent, which will allow it to quickly gain power. Moreover, Renault, as much as de Gaulle, probably rightly believes he can count on the industrial capabilities of the United States to remain in the war for the long term. This would allow the country to preserve the core of its international image, its democratic and republican political system, as well as to maintain its status, though weakened, alongside the great democratic powers of the time. But this reasoning is opposed by a military perspective that takes greater account of the realities on the ground, which is also perfectly valid. This is how Renault, a competent political leader but without military experience, on May 29th asked Generalissimo Weygand, who is not well liked by politicians but is an experienced military leader, to study the hypothesis of the Breton Redoubt, even as the final act of the Battle of France is approaching. Thus, Weygand, contrary to what was rather oddly reproached to him later, studies the matter professionally from May 29th while reorganizing the French army and preparing what he considers the country's final defense line. He presents Renault with a plan and resources to defend a Breton stronghold. In practice, the idea is to rely on the two exploitable obstacles that the terrain offers in this part of the country, namely the Couesnon and the Vilaine, two rivers that form a sort of natural barrier at the entrance to the territory, although a fragile one. Given the disparity in forces present, both in numbers and equipment, he believes, and probably rightly so, that it is essential to set up a sufficiently strong line of fortification, allowing them to hold out over time while limiting the consumption of human and material resources inherent to combat. The Supreme Commander stated that the project needs 25,000 workers and a minimum of 3 months to reach an adequately robust defense level. He believes that, given the reduced front and resulting fortifications under these conditions, these positions can be held by only 18 French infantry divisions as long as they are fully equipped and trained. But is this achievable in practice? Well, the answer is simple. Unfortunately, no. It was at the end of May when the idea was first proposed. It was unimaginable that France could keep fighting the war from Brittany. This is due to 3 primary reasons. On May 29th, the French command is aware that the second phase of the German offensive is imminent, possibly within days or even hours. On the German side, the offensive was originally planned for May 31st, 1940, but was postponed to June 5th, thanks to the heroism of the French troops at Lille and Dunkirk, who gave very precious days to the French divisions, taking up hedgehog positions on the Somme, in Picardy, and in Champagne. From the end of May, the French military, simply by observing German movements, know perfectly well that they simply do not have the 3 months required to set up the defense of the Breton Redoubt. But that's not all. The French forces are already stretched to the limit on the front, while also being particularly immobile, which precisely justifies the hedgehog tactic implemented by Weygand. France has no reserves remaining. Meanwhile, the British, considering the battle lost, choose to send back only one of their divisions evacuated at Dunkirk, on the continent, which is scheduled to arrive on June 18th in order to contribute to the defense of their allies' territory. In fact, on the French side, moving a sufficient number of infantry divisions to Brittany from an active front where clashes occur daily, while also facing several German armored divisions, is, strategically speaking, simply unrealistic. Withdrawing even a single division from the front line would simply open the way for the enemy panzer divisions, which have repeatedly demonstrated in May their ability to catch up with and cut to pieces moving infantry divisions, and therefore unable to effectively face an armored attack. Moreover, even if it were successful, this move would inevitably doom the men of the 17 fortress divisions who were still mobilized on the Maginot Line at that time, who simply do not have the equipment or support units that would allow them to fight in open country. And yet it is essential for carrying out a retreat, which in this case would inevitably have to be done while fighting. Finally, the movement exposes the flank of the Army of the Alps, facing Italy, whose imminent entry into the war is now certain. In short, from both a military strategy and logistics perspective, the operation is neither worthwhile nor credible. But there's also a third point that we don't necessarily think about. By giving up fighting on the Somme, as well as in the Picardy and Champagne plains, in order to retreat to Brittany, France loses almost all of its metropolitan war industry. At that time, Brittany simply had no industry producing war equipment for the army. What would allow in this scenario the French army to continue fighting long enough for possible outside help to arrive? Doubts were also raised during the study of the project about the ability of Breton agriculture to feed a sudden influx of people. This applies to the thousands of men in the divisions responsible for defense. The Redoubt, the entire state apparatus, evacuated and remobilized in Brittany, and the many civilians who took refuge there. In short, from a strictly practical point of view, this hypothesis does indeed seem, as Supreme Commander Weygand bluntly ended up telling the President of the Council, Paul Reynaud, to belong, I quote, to the realm of fantasy. But then, why does Reynaud bring it up again on June 12th, when the barrier formed by the Weygand line collapses, despite the situation's obviousness? The subject of the Breton Redoubt, once it is established that it is not militarily credible, becomes nothing more than a political issue, to which a Paul Reynaud, just as overwhelmed by events as he is aware of the catastrophic political consequences that a separate peace would have for France, clings. It is actually at that moment that two different visions about the course of events arise again, each of which is perfectly understandable, but each is concerned with different issues. While France plunges headfirst into defeat, despite the courage of its soldiers. The first is to keep the country at war regardless of the cost. Even if it means abandoning the mainland, its people, and most of the French army to their fate. While considering the war's global, ideological, and comprehensive scope. The second option is to salvage what's possible, aiming for a traditional peace, likely involving territorial concessions and potential reparations, as was the case for France in 1871 and Germany in 1919, but also preserving the remaining French army and sparing civilians from a potentially brutal occupation. History, however, proved the supporters of the first option right, who were notably Reynaud and de Gaulle, while the supporters of the second quickly became divided, both because of disillusionment regarding the terms of peace and because of deep political disagreements. The ideological differences among supporters of the second option and the well-organized peace terms meant to unite them. France and its empire, subject to German will, thus in practice paved the way to power, from what remained of the French state to the various factions of the French far right at the time, and to collaboration.